So in today's gospel reading, we see that Jesus has set his face to go to Jerusalem. And Luke uses this phrase to point to Jesus' focus and determination on his own crucifixion and resurrection. As he gets closer to Jerusalem, he comes closer to his own death and his resurrection. But he's not in Jerusalem yet, and what happens next may surprise you. Along the way, a Samaritan town refuses to take in Jesus because he's focused elsewhere. He's not focused on them. But this wouldn't really be uncommon at the time for Jews and Samaritans not to be hospitable to one another. In fact, it would be expected. But then two of the disciples asked Jesus if they should command fire to come down from heaven to destroy that Samaritan town. And if we think about this, this is really shocking. Not only do they escalate from being turned away in a town to wanting to kill everybody in it, but these are disciples. Sure, they're fallible, but to wipe out an entire town? It's kind of a drastic overreaction. So of course Jesus rebukes them. This last Monday, I ended up spending a good portion of Monday morning fighting an error with our Microsoft Office licensing. So even after fixing it, I was really irritated. The loss of time, just the whole process that I went through, the fact that I couldn't do it quickly. I was even joking with Pastor Neil that I wish I could just light the computers on fire and beat them with a hammer. And maybe this isn't on the same scale as suggesting that we should burn down a city, but it does make me think. What other times in my life have I dwelled on my anger? What other times has my reaction to a situation warranted a rebuke from Christ? When we say or read rebuke, I think it carries a negative connotation. We think of being rebuked as falling short of being perfect, as if being wrong makes us less in the eyes of Jesus. But that's not what Jesus' life tells us about God. Jesus' rebuke of the disciples isn't to show distance between God and the disciples. The rebuke itself is actually an act of love. It's an action that shows while Jesus is still focused on his crucifixion and resurrection, he still cares enough about the disciples to teach them. And if we read Jesus as teaching instead of condemning them for what they've done, the passage takes on a completely different character than if we keep trying to measure the disciples' statements and Jesus' reactions to them and ourselves against what we think is perfect. There's a correctional element in each lesson that Jesus says that we can't disregard. But we also need to hold it in tension. We need to hold it in tension with the divine love that Jesus provides behind it. The correction is not to work us toward being infallible. It's to make us more whole, both with ourselves and with one another. When the first person says, "I will follow you wherever you will go," and Jesus says, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head," Jesus is pointing to the transient nature of his ministry, and by extension, the disciples' ministry. Jesus isn't just complaining that he doesn't have a home. He's teaching the person saying this that their whole world will be changed when they follow Christ. Their priorities of what they value, the work that they do, takes on a completely different perspective because of who they're following. The second one says, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus replies, "Let the dead bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Now, without the lens of Christ's love, this sounds horrible. It sounds harsh. The person has lost their father, and Jesus is telling them to not really think about that, don't address that, go back to proclaim the kingdom of God. But I think two things are important to know here. The first, Jesus' words actually mirror a similar phrase in Jeremiah 16 and Ezekiel 24. In both of these cases, the lack of mourning in the situation isn't about the person's situation and an emotional connection to those that they're mourning. It actually points to the steadfastness of a mission, steadfastness and determination of what's happening. So this phrase, taken in consideration, is actually being used to highlight both Jesus' determination in continuing toward Jerusalem, but also offering this perspective to the disciples. And the second point is that we can focus on what the phrase points to instead of the phrase itself. So what does God tell us to focus on within our own lives? What would it look like if we followed it with the same determination that Jesus models for us? The last person that Jesus responds to in the gospel reading says, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say farewell to those at my home." Then Jesus responds, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." Again, if we take this literally, it sounds like Jesus is against people working or being home. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. When a plow is being used, the person controlling it has to remain focused on the plow in order to dig the trenches in straight lines. If they lose focus on the plow, they can run into another row, they can run into rocks. They ruin the planting. Jesus is making a point here that the disciples, again, should be focused and determined on their following of Christ, instead of going back and forth in their priorities. And this is hard to wrestle with because we want to be able to take a break from following Christ at times. In my case with the computer, can't I just dwell in my anger for a while? Can't I just give in to being destructive? If we frame it in terms of relationships, maybe we just want to be less forgiving of one another when it suits us. Maybe we don't reach out to the person when we see that they need it this one time. Maybe we don't leave our comfort zones and serve the world around us because we're comfortable doing what we're doing. But when I look at each of the points that Jesus is making here, I no longer see Jesus telling the disciples that they aren't measuring up to his and therefore God's expectations of them. I see Jesus reframing their perspectives on what they should be focusing on. Something that I struggle with is being a perfectionist. I'm constantly finding flaws in myself, and my internal voice is constantly pointing them out. So it's easy for me to try to measure myself up against Jesus' lessons and see that I fall short every time. But Jesus isn't asking us to be perfect. Jesus asks that we remain focused on him. Jesus asks that we follow him the best that we can. And this doesn't mean that we're perfect while we do so. It means that the choice we make is to live a life that is modeled by Christ. A life that serves the world around us. It means that we set our face toward a future of hope. Because the world as it is not the kingdom that God hopes for humanity. The divisions that led the disciples to ask if they could destroy the Samaritan town still exist. And Jesus' lesson to them applies just as much to us today. And it's easy to point the finger at the disciples, saying, well, I would never want to destroy a town for not being hospitable. Yet how often do we put walls up in relationships to avoid differing opinions, differing worldviews, different views of faith? It's a natural human tendency to seek similarity. But when we seek it to a point that we surround ourselves with our own likeness, is this not just another form of destruction? To truly set our faces towards God's kingdom means that we bring others into our community. Not in a sense of where they conform to what we want them to be, but we make space within ourselves for them to be who they are created to be alongside of us. And we love them for it. So what would it look like for each of our own lives for us to focus on this type of hospitality? Or perhaps there's something else in your heart that you're being called to focus on. Perhaps it's reaching across boundaries set by political views. Instead of mistrust that leads toward destruction, let's focus on Jesus' example of extreme hospitality. I want to share with you the words of Henry Nouwen. The paradox of hospitality is that it wants to create emptiness, not a fearful emptiness, but a friendly emptiness, where strangers can enter and discover themselves as created free. Free to sing their own songs, free to speak their own languages, dance their own dances, and free also to leave and follow their own vocations. May we remain focused on following Christ and creating this space within ourselves and the communities we live in. Amen.